"I didn't do it, Mom. It was Christie." Just imagine that. Those were the desperate, chilling final words of Timothy Evans to his mother right before he was sent to the gallows to hang. It's literally the ultimate nightmare, right? Being executed for a horrific crime you absolutely didn't commit, all while the real monster is just living quietly downstairs.
Now, the truth wouldn't actually come to light until 1953, which is a full 3 years after Timothy Evans was executed. So picture this. A new tenant, a guy named Beresford Brown, is fixing up this squalid little ground floor flat in London's Notting Hill. He's just trying to put up a shelf in the kitchen, you know? But as he peels back some wallpaper covering a hollow wall, he uncovers this hidden alcove. And inside, well, he finds the horrifying remains of 3 women. This gruesome, accidental discovery blew the lid right off a whole decade of completely undetected serial murder at 10 Rillington Place.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving deep into the unbelievably dark and twisted true story of John Reginald Christie. We're going to break down exactly how a serial killer operated right under the noses of the police, manipulated the entire justice system, and sent an innocent man to his death.
Part 1, The Monster Next Door, John Christie's Origins. Let's really look at where this guy came from, because as you'll see, his psychology is the absolute key to everything. So John Christie was born back in 1899 in Halifax. He grew up in this household with a super strict, uncommunicative father and these domineering older sisters who constantly bossed him around. And this dynamic, it instilled in him this really deep, lifelong resentment of female authority and this twisted, desperate craving for control. Now, he was actually highly intelligent. He later tested with an IQ of 128, but he suffered from lifelong impotence. As a teenager, his peers actually mocked his sexual failures, giving him these humiliating nicknames like Reggie No Dick. Later on, after serving in World War I, he claimed that a mustard gas attack left him blind and mute for over 3 years. But here's the thing, medical records totally didn't back that up. Experts later chalked up his exaggerated ailments to a histrionic personality disorder. Basically, the guy desperately craved attention and sympathy.
And you really have to notice the sheer duality of his existence here. I mean, he built the perfect camouflage. Publicly, especially during World War II, he became a Special War Reserve constable. He wore a uniform, he commanded authority, and neighbors just knew him as this polite, fastidious guy. But his private reality? It was a dark, criminal underworld. He actually had a whole string of convictions for theft and violent assault. He frequented prostitutes, and he fostered this sickening obsession with absolute dominance over women, an obsession that eventually escalated to serial murder and necrophilia.
That brings us to part 2, a deadly modus operandi. The killing begins. Because to understand how he evaded capture for so long, we've got to look at his highly calculated methods. You see, Christie didn't just attack random strangers in dark alleys. He actually lured vulnerable women right into his own home by posing as this sort of healer. Step 1, he'd offer medical treatment. For one victim, he claimed he had this special mixture of friar's balsam to cure her bronchitis. For others, he offered illegal abortions. Then, step 2, he'd have them breathe through a tube connected to a jar, but he'd secretly introduce domestic coal gas into the mix, which was super rich in carbon monoxide. Finally, step 3, as that gas rendered the victim completely unconscious, he would strike. So the really crucial takeaway here is that Christie's impotence and his deep-seated insecurities meant he could literally only perform sexually when his victims were entirely helpless, unconscious, or dying. It's incredibly grim. When we look at the tragic scale of his crimes over this terrifying 10-year span, a really dark pattern starts to emerge. It begins back in 1943 with Ruth First and Muriel Adey, who he actually buried in his own tiny back garden. Then you'll notice a bit of a gap, right? And then boom, in 1949, the murders of his neighbors, young Beryl Evans and her baby Geraldine. And just look at that devastating escalation at the very end. After murdering his own wife, Ethel, in late 1952, he completely spiraled out of control, killing 3 more women in just a matter of weeks in early 1953. Moving on to part 3, the ultimate betrayal framing Timothy Evans. This right here is the darkest chapter of the whole story, revolving around one of the absolute most infamous miscarriages of justice in British history. It poses a question that frankly defies all logic. How on earth did a serial killer, a guy with bodies literally buried in his own backyard, convince the police that his neighbor was the true murderer? Well, it all starts in 1948,
when Timothy Evans and his wife, Beryl, move into the top-floor flat at 10 Rillington Place. Now, Tim was this young van driver from Wales. He was illiterate, easily confused, kind of prone to making up tall tales, and he had an IQ estimated at just 70. He and Beryl had a baby girl, Geraldine, and they were really struggling financially. So, when Beryl unexpectedly became pregnant again, sheer panic set in. And because of all this, they were the absolute perfect prey for a manipulative predator like John Christie. Learning that Beryl was desperately seeking an illegal abortion, Christie approached him and just flat out told him, "I can solve this problem." Under the guise of his totally phony medical expertise, Christie convinced them to let him perform the procedure. So Tim goes off to work, completely unaware he's leaving his wife in the hands of a monster. When Tim finally came back, Christie told him Beryl tragically died during the abortion. He utterly terrified Tim, telling him they were both going to go to prison, and he successfully manipulated this young, confused guy into fleeing London, all while promising to hand baby Geraldine over to a nice couple in East Acton. Eventually, overcome with guilt and confusion, Evans actually went to the police himself. And this is where we see the absolutely catastrophic failures of the investigation. When the police first searched Rillington Place, they completely missed Beryl and Geraldine's bodies, which were hidden right out in the wash house. And they didn't even bother excavating the garden where 2 other skeletons were laying. They totally ignored the fact that builders were actively working in that same wash house on the very day Evans supposedly hid the bodies there. On top of that, a linguistic expert later pointed out that Evans's typed confessions contained all this high-register police vocabulary, things like incurring debts or terrific argument, words that an illiterate man from the Welsh valleys simply would never use. But the most fatal mistake? The police placed blind trust in John Christie. Why? Mostly because he was this respectable former War Reserve constable, so they just took his word over a working-class, uneducated young man's. 40. That is the number of minutes. Just 40 minutes. It took the jury to deliberate and wrongly convict Timothy Evans of murder. Despite Evans completely retracting his confession and pointing the finger directly at Christie right there in court, Christie was the prosecution's star witness. So Evans was hanged in March 1950. Christie literally got away with murder, aided by the exact same justice system that he had been mocking all along. Which brings us to part 4, Discovery and Justice, the fall of John Christie. Because eventually, Christie's own hubris and his absolute madness would finally catch up with him. Following Evans's execution, Christie lived totally free for nearly 3 more years. But the tension inside his own home was building up. In December 1952, he actually strangled his wife of 32 years, Ethel, right in their bed. He prized up the floorboards in the front room, buried her right there, and then proceeded to walk over her body every single day. And with Ethel gone, she was really the last informal check on his behavior. Christie just completely spiraled. He lured 3 more women to his flat in rapid succession, hiding them right behind the kitchen wallpaper. This rapid, sloppy escalation is what led directly to his downfall. Out of money and totally out of his mind, Christie fraudulently sublet his apartment and moved out on March 20th, 1953. Just 4 days later, the real landlord let a new tenant in, who, as we know, quickly found those bodies in the wall. A massive manhunt kicked off, and Christie was actually found sleeping rough on the embankment near Putney Bridge. He was tried, convicted in the exact same courtroom as Evans, and executed in July 1953. It took decades, but the horrific truth could no longer be ignored. And on October 18, 1966, Timothy Evans finally received a historic posthumous pardon. Now, in a seriously dark twist of historical irony, Christie was hanged by Albert Pierpoint. That is the exact same executioner who had hanged the innocent Timothy Evans. The story goes that as Christie was pinioned, with his arms tied behind his back on the gallows, he nervously complained that his nose was itching. Pierpoint just leaned in and simply said, "It won't bother you for long." The murders at 10 Rillington Place give us a terrifying look into the mind of a psychopath, for sure. But they also force us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. What happens when a justice system relies on prejudice? When it assumes that a well-spoken former police officer must be telling the truth, and a confused, uneducated young man must be lying. That blind trust in respectability didn't just allow a serial killer to roam free, it actively helped him send an innocent man to his death. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this deep dive gave you a much clearer understanding of this incredibly tragic piece of history.